Hi, good evening, everybody. A very warm welcome to you all. Chag Sameach, happy Hanukkah. I'm Doris Epstein, co-chair of the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research in Toronto. On October 7th, the world changed forever. For the Jewish people, it was a double trauma. First, Israel was savagely attacked by terrorist Hamas, and secondly, the massive support in democratic countries for this genocidal terrorist group has shocked and terrified. For the first time in the history of Canada, Jews do not feel safe. But ramifications of this latest war against the Jews goes far beyond Israel and Hamas. It has changed the global configurations of power and allies. Tonight, CIJR founder and executive director, Professor Frederick Krantz, will tackle the monumental issues of the post-October 7th world we live in. First, a big thanks to our community sponsors, Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights, the Canadian Education and Anti-Semitism Foundation, the Lodger Congregation, the Israel Activist Center, and End Jew Hatred Canada. The Canadian Institute for Jewish Research began well over 35 years ago in Montreal. A group of professors, founded and headed by Professor Krantz, were seeing rampant anti-Semitism on the Montreal campuses. They began the battle of combating it. Conferences, speakers, publications, symposia, anything and everything to fight the misinformation and bias against Israel. Sounds familiar? Unfortunately, we haven't stopped. In fact, it's gotten worse. And what we do, whatever we do in that level, has greater urgency than ever before. Through CIJR's publications, such as the Daily Briefing, you can depend on in-depth, fact-based analyses of Israel, Jewish culture, and world politics. You'll find information on Daily Briefing you'll find nowhere in the media. And a reminder, CIJR is a not-for-profit organization whose work with students and for Israel is entirely dependent on tax-free donations. And now, Professor Krantz.
Good evening. I'd like to dedicate tonight's talk to a man I call my teacher, although I didn't study with him formally. I learned a great deal from him. Emil Fackenheim. Fackenheim was a German Jewish Holocaust refugee, a man who was a professor of philosophy and a rabbi who wound up in Toronto, teaching at the University of Toronto. He's one of the greatest students of Jewish history and Jewish thought of the 20th century, and is well worth reading today, particularly since his work involved much of it responding to the Holocaust and then responding to the miraculously reborn Jewish state of Israel. Two works specifically would repay reading. I'll give you the titles. One is Fackenheim's The Jewish Return into History, and the other is Fackenheim's God's Presence in History. He was both a secular and a Judaic thinker, quite a rare combination. We're going to look tonight at the October 7th event, the horrible
Here's
pogrom,
what I found.
The horrible pogrom in Gaza, October 7th event in Gaza, from a number of overlapping perspectives. I'm going to use the metaphor of concentric rings of explanation. One Hebraic Judaic, the other modern secular. When we look at Jewish history, there's nothing specifically new about what happened on October 7th. Violence and persecution of Jews, the destruction of Jewish communities has been endemic across what one historian calls our sad history. From the Egyptians under Pharaoh in Exodus, to Babylon, to Rome, to early Christianity, the Emperor Constantine, to the medieval church and medieval feudal monarchies, the Protestant Reformation and Luther, to the Chmielnitsky pogroms in the 17th century, to the terrible letdown of the Jewish world and persecution following the failure of the false Messiah Shabbatai Tzvi in the 17th century. A persecution, pogrom, has not exactly been something new. In modern secular history, this theme continues. Even with the birth of liberalism in the nation state in the 19th century, the question was posed, it was called the Jewish question. Can we absorb the Jews into modern structures, which were post-Christian, of course? And one of the answers was no. We find also the development of Bolshevism, Russian Revolution, fascism, Nazism, the emergence of racial anti-Semitism, which is a novum, it's a new thing. Earlier anti-Semitism was religious or cultural. Racism is new because it says no matter what a Jew does, he or she cannot change their nature and their threat to the larger Christian society. Without racial anti-Semitism, probably they could not have had the Holocaust, which was an attempt for the first time to utterly destroy and do away with Judaism, all told, every living Jew. So there's nothing new about this. After World War II, you have the Soviet anti-Semitism, the development of the United Nations, the Zionism is racism claim, terrible thing at the UN from 1975 forward. And then the invention under Soviet auspices with Egyptian help of the Palestinians. There had never been, quote, Palestinians, unquote, before. The Arabs of the region were Arabs. They were not members of a national entity which did not exist. But with the development of Palestinianism, we get the PLO, which is brought into being in 1964, again under Soviet aegis, and the development of terrorism. And we know the whole sad story of terrorism down through the development of the Oslo Accords, which were a terrible mistake in 1993, setting up the PA, and then the taking away of Israeli population in Gaza in 2005, which was a second mistake, which allowed Hamas, which was a creation of Iran, a terrorist movement under the Iranian mullah's wings, to come in 2006 and to evict the Palestinian Authority in 2007, and gave rise to a sheer terrorist state firing rockets at Israel from the Israeli southern border. So all of that is background to October 7th. What is new about October 7th? What's new about it isn't the murderous Islamic Jew hatred. It isn't the anti-Semitism. Rather, it is the scale, the size, and the force of the attack. The 67 war, and particularly the 1973 Yom Kippur War, was a surprise. But now this came into the very border of Israel. It broke through that border despite supposedly superior Israeli intelligence. And it resulted in the death of 1,400 innocent civilians, the taking of 240 some odd hostages. And to this day, despite a brief ceasefire in which some hostages thankfully were let free, there remain something like 150, 160 hostages in the hands of Hamas, which has announced it will not release them until the war is brought to a successful, from its point of view, conclusion. So all of this is nothing new, particularly to religious Jews. The religious year in Judaism is punctuated by remembrances of persecutions and triumphs over persecutions. And if you're a secular and you have any familiarity with Jewish history or biblical history, it's not new to you either. But it is new, and it's quite surprising, and I'm going to come back to this later in the talk. It is new to completely ignorant young people, particularly, who are being cranked out by our institutions as know-nothings and easily malleable material for propaganda, anti-Israel, anti-Jewish propaganda, such that we've seen a revival, which is shocking to many, of anti-Semitism in the United States and Canada. And we're fighting that to this day, and this talk is part of that struggle, that fight. the institutions which used to be known as universities, which are now factories for the production of ignorance and hatred, are a key factor in this. Their products are streaming out into the media and into business and into sports and so on. And that poses a very real problem for us in the future. I'm going to come back to that later in the talk and look at not only the Gaza situation, but the regional structure, the global structure, and some observations on the problem of the survival of Western civilization. That's a big order, but I hope you'll help me out with your questions at the end of my talk. So now to Gaza. Gaza is inconceivable without Iranian backing, support, financial and military, and Iranian control. The role of Iran has to be looked at. It is the key problem. It is the head of the serpent. Without severing that head, none of the problems we're going to talk about will be permanently solved. Gaza itself is interesting because we now know more clearly that it was part of a planned three-prong attack on Israel. There was to be all orchestrated by Iran. There was to be the breaking into the southern border by Hamas in the south. There was to be the breaking into the north by Hezbollah, a larger, much more powerful terrorist organization in Lebanon, which is at the beck and call of Iran. And also the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, was to rise, where there is significant now Hamas presence. And the three together would either crush Israel finally once and for all and destroy the Jewish state, or at the minimum, so deliver a blow to it, take thousands of hostages, kill tens of thousands of Israelis, that Israel would be weakened and set up for subsequent attack later. It was to be a massive attack, and it was supported indirectly by the Russians and by China, as we shall come back and see a little later in the talk. What happened? Why didn't this three-prong attack take place? There are a number of reasons to look at very briefly. One is the resistance after initial surprise by the Israelis themselves, particularly the settlers in the kibbutzim along the southern border, by the military police there, and by elements of the IDF, which after initial surprise and a degree of paralysis rallied quickly and shattered the invading forces such that they could not break through and connect to the West Bank, which was their goal. That's one factor. Second factor is, it seems that Hamas was so sure of itself and so hated the Jews that it couldn't wait. And particularly the music festival in the desert spurred them to act. The music wafted over into Gaza. They hated it. They hate the Jews. They hate the seculars. And they moved before they were supposed to, breaking up the tripartite plan. The third element is also important. That is that the Iranians are not Arabs. They're Persians. And the Iranians are not Sunni Muslims, which is the majority sect. They are Shiites. So the Iranians basically resent the Sunni, whether they're in Hamas or whether they're in Saudi Arabia, and see them as Untermenschen. And it's very difficult for them to work with them and to cooperate with them. And that complicated the coordinated plan as well. For whatever reasons, it didn't work. And Israel has had time, very importantly, has had time to array its forces in the north and to organize them to take on the Hezbollah. It's a serious strategic mistake. Military history, military strategy is very important. It's underestimated in most analyses, particularly in the media. But Israel has the finest army in the Middle East. It is a conscript army. It is a volunteer army. It has to be mobilized. Israel now has some 600,000 troops, and the bulk of them are now massed on the Lebanese border facing Hezbollah, which is very important. Israel has had a strategic time in the south in order to deal with Hamas, and I'll come back to that, and the role of Biden and the Americans. And it's had the strategic time in the north to deal with Hezbollah. There are also Iranian Guard troops in Syria, where there was a Russian contingent, as you know, and they were to be mobilized as well, including supposedly transporting a Shiite militia from Iraq, which is a bit further away, but not all that far. So you can see the seriousness of the situation and the fact that today, 2 months later almost, Israel is in much better strategic and tactical position to deal with the threat to its existence. That's the Gaza situation. There's no doubt that Israel will be able to defeat and exterminate, I use the term advisedly, Hamas. Hamas is a barbarous movement. It's Islamic, Islamicist. It's a movement of hatred, inhumanity. It exists in order to kill Jews, and the only way to deal with it is to eliminate it. Israel is now united. One of the things that October 7th has produced is a remarkable degree of unity between left and right, religious, secular, in Israel, and they are united over the demand that Hamas be extirpated, root and branch, including its leadership, and never again have a future on a border contiguous to Israel. So that's very important. That is happening as we go. It is difficult. It is tragic to watch the situation of the hostages who are suffering, those who are still under Hamas control. It is tragic also to watch the young guys and gals of the IDF. 130, 140 have already been killed in this campaign, and how remarkable they are. You all must have seen the video of the Israeli women, the soldiers, women soldiers in their tanks, who rushed to the aid of the Sderot set community population and helped save the day. Remarkable. Israeli Jewish Amazons, I call them. But things there are under control militarily, and the situation in the north is solid. So we can at least take a breath as far as that is concerned. Now let's take a look at the, I won't deal with scenarios, post-Gaza scenarios. How will Gaza be ruled? What is Israel's role? I'll come back to that again a bit later. Now let's look at the region, the regional situation. When we look at the region, a number of things have to be taken into account. One, Iranian control. Two, the role of Hezbollah in Lebanon, as I've noted, the Iranian troops in Syria, and so on. The situation in the north is changed. There can be no return to earlier plans or program. One of them was that the way to deal with Hezbollah was to keep it about 20 kilometers north of the Litani River in the north, giving Israel a buffer zone. But the fact of the matter is that in the years since that agreement was supposedly passed, the Hezbollah terrorists have simply moved closer and closer to the border. The UN troops, which are supposed to patrol the area, are hopeless and useless. They are always hopeless and useless wherever they are placed, insofar as the Middle East is concerned. And something will have to be done with the Israeli-Lebanese border. Essentially, what has to be done is that Hezbollah, like Hamas, has to be shattered. And when they're shattered, Israel can work with the remainder of the Lebanese groups. Alongside those Hezbollah Shiite terrorists, we do find relatively Pacific Sunni Muslims in Lebanon, and of course, an important contingent of Christians. And you may recall that Israel has in the past repeatedly worked fairly well with the Christians and the Sunni Muslims. And that is what's on the order plate for the future of Lebanon. Lebanon is a state, unlike Gaza. Gaza is not a state. Gaza is a kind of mafia outfit run by the Hamas. Lebanon has a tradition of being a state going back to the post-World War I period when it was under French aegis. So there's something to work with there, and there is a parliament, but now it's dominated by the Hezbollah terrorists. So I look forward to, and a lot of analysts look forward to, nothing original in my view, that Israel will, having dealt with Hamas, have to turn to Hezbollah, and will have to overcome Hezbollah militarily and shatter it, if at all possible, and reconfigure Lebanon as a relatively pacific state alongside Israel. What to do with Syria is probably beyond Israel's scope. Syria is today a chaotic mess. It's had 11 years of civil war. Half the population has been displaced. Over 1 million have been murdered, killed. Assad is a figurehead in power only through largely Russian support and some Arab financial support. So Syria will have to stew in its own juices and become as marginal insofar as the key problem of Israel's security is concerned. And that is the key problem, which has to be looked at, which has to be emphasized by the Jewish world, by Israelis, by we Jews in diaspora, and by anybody of goodwill looking at the situation and wanting to seek further bloodshed. Israel's security must be guaranteed. It cannot live as it has in recent years under the gun in various directions. And that's what the meaning of this current crisis is. Israel must find the strength, and we must find the support for settling the situation in a stable and long-term manner. And this brings us to the Americans in relation to the situation. We have been surprised, frankly, many of us, by President Biden's support for Israel. He immediately indicated his unconditional support. He flew immediately to Israel and embraced someone he doesn't really like, Bibi Netanyahu, and he sent 2 powerful American armadas, fleets, clustered around aircraft carriers, one to the Mediterranean, one to the Persian Gulf, including a nuclear submarine, and missile frigates, and so on. You may be familiar with the story of Balaam's ass from the Bible, about the evil magician, false prophet, who goes off to denounce a city riding on a donkey, and along the way the donkey looks at him and says, "What are you doing? You're doing a terrible thing. Why are you going to do this? Why don't you turn back? You're doing the wrong thing." And he beats the donkey with a stick, and he finally gets to the city, and there he is destroyed. Biden isn't exactly Balaam, but he's better than Barack Obama would have been. There's no doubt about it. And although he's under great pressure and he waffles, and the Americans are trying to delimit the thing, and they're bringing up the 2-state solution again, etc., Biden, by and large, has maintained his support for Israel and has made a big difference. Remember his address, and he was addressing the Iranians and the Hezbollah, and he said, don't. And there were 2 American fleets in the waters contiguous to the area to back him up. That has been very, very important, and I think we ought to not take too seriously the wafflings that are underway. We have to also understand, again, one of the concentric rings, politics, American politics. Biden is facing an election in November of 2024. His polls are horrendous. He's down to about 30%, 31% popular approval. His rival, Trump, despite all kinds of questionable legal actions being taken against him by the Justice Department, dominated by the Democratic Party, gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And even if they convict Trump on something, if he's got the nomination, he will probably be elected while in jail. He could be, in which case he will pardon himself. So what's coming is Biden has to be very careful. He has to balance the left wing of his Democratic Party, which is pro-Hamas, which is anti-Semitic, the progressives, as we all know, and they're pressuring him, and he has to balance them against the bulk of the party, which remains relatively centrist, insofar as Israel is concerned, certainly. And he can't afford another Afghanistan. One more collapse, either in Ukraine, by the way, or in Israel, would finish him completely as a potential presidential candidate. He may withdraw anyway because of his age-related problems and his neurological problems before the convention this summer. That remains to be seen. But for the moment, in a way, Israel has a lever on Biden politically for the moment. So come November 2024, if Trump or DeSantis or someone, or Haley even, is elected, the whole picture changes for Israel and for global politics, because then you'll have a forward-looking, strong American foreign policy, and Iran will not get away with what it's gotten away with to this point. I mean, after all, there are over 100 attacks on American troops in Syria and Iraq, sponsored by Iran, by the Shiite militia. There's been no real response. They have triggered the Houthi terrorists in Yemen, supplied them with missiles, and then the Houthi are firing ballistic missiles at shipping, Israeli-related and otherwise, in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden and the Bab el-Mandab Strait. Shipping companies now are stopping their ships from going in the area, which is going to have a negative effect on world trade and supply lines and inflation, the cost of goods. Biden still hasn't done much about that either. That's going to change November 4th, or at least after the election of a Republican president. And that is something to look forward to. That is certainly a hopeful sign. Now, the problem here for us is to be, the point I want to make, analytically, we have to be very realistic. We have to be very concrete, and we have to make ensuring Israel's well-being and security a priority. And it turns out that Israel's well-being and security leads to a stable Middle East and a stable world, which is in the interest of the United States as well, and of course of Western Europe more generally. So Israel, once again, is at the center, the very center of a very complex overlapping structure of political and military considerations. Russia, China, and Iran, along with North Korea, constitute a new kind of axis, very similar to the one during World War II. For those of you who are older or know some history, you can think analogically. There's an analog between the current situation globally and that of the world in 1938-39. Then you had, of course, the Nazis allying with Japan and fascist Italy, and beginning the takeover of Europe with pressure on Czechoslovakia, and then in 1939, the invasion of Poland. Today, Germany, so to speak, is Russia in Ukraine. Japan is China, which is threatening the South China Sea and Taiwan and seeking its place in the sun, expanding all over the world. Belt and Road initiatives, use of its loans to third world countries, expanding even into Latin America, where it's vying with the United States' traditional position there, and so on. And the year is about 1938 or 1939. Israel and Russia and Ukraine are maybe Czechoslovakia-Poland, insofar as that is concerned. But there is one difference between World War II's coming to be and the current threatening situation. And that is that today we have to deal with the nuclear problem, the nuclear threat. One false move, one mistake and we could see tragically the beginnings of a chain reaction leading to nuclear confrontation. Pakistan, an Islamic nation, has nuclear weapons. The Iranians are on the edge of nuclear weapons. They've been supported by Pakistan and by North Korea. North Korea has become a world power by the result of its own nuclear weapons. It's a terribly dangerous world. Putin is threatening the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. That brings us back to Iran. Iran is not only the head of the serpent insofar as the Middle East is concerned. If the Iranians get a nuclear weapon, and they may have one already for all we know, some specialists think they may have one or two, that will be the most dangerous situation we've been in since 1945, because the Iranians are religious mystics. They are looking forward to the return of their Mahdi, their Messiah, who will come when the world is turned into turmoil. The Iranians think in terms of eschatological crisis, a world balance, world chaos, in which the Mahdi will return and they, Islam, will become the center of the world, and they will put down the great Satan, the United States, and its Christian allies in Europe, and the little Satan, Israel, the Jewish world, behind it. And that's very important to understand. Very, very, very important. Islam is not about nations. Hamas doesn't want a state. The Palestinians don't want a state. If they wanted a state, they could have had one. Israel offered them a state 2 or 3 times on very good terms in the last 20 years. They want a caliphate. They want an Islamic ruled world under the thumb of a theocratic leader like the Khamenei ruler of Iran. That's what they're out for. The marriage of Russia and China with Iran is only temporary insofar as the Iranians are concerned, because neither the Russians, who are either Christian or atheistic, or the Chinese, who are Asian and either Buddhist or whatever, are not Muslims. And for the Muslim, if you're not the Muslim Islamist, the true Islamist, if you're not a Muslim, you are not human. That is why it's okay to kill the kafir. It's okay to kill the non-believer. If they won't submit to you, if they won't become your semi-slave, they can be obliterated and destroyed. And we see that again and again in the history of Islam, from the breakout of Muhammad from the Arab Peninsula in the 7th century forward. So we have to look at this. It's very important. The Iranians and the Islamists are not crazies. They have their own vision of the world, their own values. They're not Western. They are anti-Western. And if push comes to shove, they will use force so long as they think they can dominate, they can win. And that's what we're looking at the moment. And it's a very typical, very precarious, very difficult moment. Finally, a word or two about Western civilization, and we can get to the questions. Western civilization is based on Judaism. It's based on Hebraic values from the biblical, the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. These biblical values of responsibility, of non-idolatry, of concern for the orphan and the widow and the poor, of the individual as part of a community to which he or she has responsibilities as well as rights. These Hebrew values of the world as a good place. It says in our Tanakh, our Bible, that when God created man, not only was it good, it was very good. And God gives nature to man to cultivate for man's use and well-being. Nature is not alive. It is not worshipped in Judaism. God is worshipped. Judaism is a monotheistic religion, the first of its kind. Our 10 commandments underlay all positive law in the modern world. Yes, the Greco-Romans had natural law ideas, and Rome had great jurisprudence, and that plugged into the Hebraic inheritance through Christianity. And that is true. But when you read the Constitution of the United States today, a sublime document, and you read those declarations about human freedom and liberty, when you read the First Amendment about the freedom of speech, the right of assembly, the right to a jury, the right to be heard by your peers, to justice, the limits on government. The Constitution is about the limits of government. The Constitution is about the rights of minorities as well as majorities, the rights of the individual. All of that flows out of the Hebrew Bible, the greatest book ever written, out of the Hebrew tradition, out of Judaism. And Christians know that. There is a constant theme in Christianity of philo-Semitism, of love for Judaism, of understanding for Judaism, not simply of anti-Semitism. And today, in today's world, some of the most powerful and important, valuable supporters of the state of Israel, the Jewish state of Israel, are, of course, Christians, and particularly the so-called fundamentalists in the United States. So Western civilization is partially at stake today in everything we're looking at. Universities are declined. They're cranking out unlearned idiots who are easily marshaled in support of vicious anti-Semitism. People demonstrating in the streets of American cities for an organization that is genocidal, Hamas. They demonstrate for the freedom of people that people that does not exist, the Palestinians, quote unquote. And if you ask many of these people, particularly the students, anything specific about what's going on, they haven't the slightest idea. They don't know where Hamas is, right? They don't know what Hamas means. They don't know anything about the history of the region. They don't know anything about religion, which is no longer taught in their grade schools or in their universities and colleges. So it's a tremendous problem. There are great threats to the values which alone maintain civilization, generally speaking, in the world, and maintain the rule of law in the world. And we are confronting it, and we're confronting it today particularly, and it's becoming more clear because of what's happened in Gaza, and because of the Israeli and the Judaic, and then the world, the decent world, response to that horror, to that nightmare. So that's where I want to end. A great deal is at stake here: the well-being of Israel, the stability of the region, the future of the United States as a democratic republic on a constitutional basis, the world order that has rested on American shoulders since 1945. And I think I'll stop at this point and open up to your questions.
All right, let's start with Iran, who you've called the head of the serpent. With its nuclear capabilities and its growing power around the world, the proxies, can it be contained?
Yes, but it takes will in order to do it. I think that, to put it bluntly, if Trump were in power today and not Biden, Iran would not have unleashed the Gaza episode. The Iranians are dependent on oil for income. Biden has allowed them to sell their oil, above all, to China and make billions and billions of dollars. Biden has pursued this will-o'-the-wisp notion that the Iranians, that you could somehow or other make the Iranians the center of gravity for the Middle East. Strange, weird notion given their political values, given their terrorist commitments. But he has done this. You started under Barack Obama with the Iran deal that he worked out, which allowed them to continue their nuclear research, gave them a lot of money, and they simply laughed and continued to do exactly what they were doing. And that's continued under Biden. And really, it's a puzzlement. People don't quite understand what's behind this, except that the left identifies with Iran. And the left is putting pressure, Democratic left, on Biden, which may explain it. But take that away, reimpose the sanctions, prevent the oil from being sold to China, and the Iranians will shrink. They will be increasingly powerless. Add to that a forward policy of dealing with them, and they can be overthrown. There is a very large and popularly rooted opposition to the mullahs, which we've seen again and again in Iran. Most recently, the movement of Iranian women who don't want to wear the head covering and be subjected to all kinds of prejudices. There would be a rising against the mullahs if the West, and particularly the US, were to support it. One of the members of the Shah's family, the former ruler, is ready to step forward and recast the whole government of Iran. That is the key, by the way. That is the medium to long-range key to stability in the Middle East, which is to destroy the terrorists at the head, do away with the mullahs regime in Iran, replace it with a stable, democratic regime. Iran has a tradition as a nation state. Iran under the Shah did have a parliament, a limited one, and that's something to build on. That in turn would connect to the elimination of Hamas from Gaza, to the rebuilding of Lebanon. That would deal with another problem in the area, which is Turkey, which under Erdogan has become increasingly Islamist. Turkey supplies drones to the Russians for use in Ukraine. Turkey has to be dealt with as well. Above all, of course, next to the importance of Iran is Saudi Arabia. The Saudis hate the Iranians. The Saudis are Sunni. The Iranians are Shiite. The Saudis want to be the dominant force in the Arab world. And the Saudis were getting closer and closer to Israel. They were about to join the Abraham Accords. And one reason for the Iranian attack launched by Hamas, and which was supposed to have been tripartite, was to destroy that gambit, to destroy the movement of the Saudis towards the Abraham Accords. Once the situation stabilizes in the Middle East, I think the Saudis will be quick to join the Abraham Accords, and then there can be a true peace in the region and true development. So Saudi Arabia, which joins the Abraham Accords, recognizes Israel. Israel plays a role in terms of technology, capital, expertise. Lebanon is restored, Iran is restored, and you have, in a way, in an odd way, isn't it? You have a kind of realization of the biblical vision of Isaiah and Jeremiah, the messianic, Jewish messianism, which is this worldly, in which all the world comes together and meets in Jerusalem to form one great humanity. And lion will lie down with lamb, and so on. And there will be no war. There will be war no more. That messianic vision can be translated into secular terms insofar as dealing with Iran, China and Russia are concerned.
Iran has created a Shiite corridor through Syria. Do you see Syria joining forces with Hezbollah to establish a second front?
As I said earlier, I don't think the Syrians are a factor per se. The Syrians have no real army any longer, no major army. They have a sufficient force to put down those who are trying to establish their independence. But they've been fighting the civil war for 11 years without real result. There still is an ongoing rebellion in the northeast of Syria. The Kurds are there. The US has forces there. There are anti-Syrian Muslim forces there. I don't think that the Syrians are a factor. There are in Syria, however, a number of Iranian National Guard battalions that might be lent to a campaign if Hezbollah finally decides out of desperation or makes a mistake and seriously attacks Israel. Those Iranian forces might come into play, but they are minor. So I don't really think the Syrians are the big problem. The issue now is whether Hezbollah will in fact draw back, whether the Iranian Godfather will not want to risk any further radicalization of its position, and perhaps come to some kind of de facto diplomatic.
Actually, why isn't Hezbollah more active? Why isn't it more aggressive?
It's a very big problem.
I thought it was being timed so to attack Israel on both fronts, north and south. Why did they hold?
Yes, that's a major issue. And there's much discussion, much debate about why. You have to remember that about 7-8 years ago, there was a more than that now, actually, about 12 years ago, there was a major confrontation on the northern border. Israel invaded the Hezbollah-dominated area and destroyed much of the Hezbollah force there. And Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, has never entirely forgotten that. And he has never, in fact, emerged. He hides. He's afraid that the Shin Bet, the Mossad rather, will get him if he comes out of hiding. So that may be a factor. But I think the larger factor is that the timing of the tripartite, the coordinated offensive against Israel was screwed up, and the moment passed, and other factors came into play. And it may well be that Nasrallah is quite happy to lob a few anti-tank shells into the northern Israeli settlements and call it a day. We'll see. But from Israel's part, I don't think that's sufficient. I think that Israel will have to, looking at it militarily, strategically, if Hezbollah is showing this relative weakness, despite its 130,000 missiles, which were supposedly going to destroy Tel Aviv, if they're showing this weakness, it may well be that this is the moment for the IDF to deal with Hezbollah once and for all.
You mentioned during your presentation that the attack on October 7th was supported by the Russians indirectly. Could you comment on that?
Yes, of course. The Russians are getting a great deal of equipment from Iran. The Iranians are supplying them with all kinds of drones. Putin and Iran have signed an agreement to set up drone factories in Russia, which are being built at this very moment. Russia is getting help from North Korea, which provides ammunition and some equipment. And that reflects a North Korean-Iranian connection, as well, of course, as a North Korean-Chinese connection. The North Koreans wouldn't be doing anything without Chinese backing and Chinese permission. The Russians want to defeat the Ukrainians and move on to perhaps the Baltics or to other areas. Putin has indicated that his great plan is to revive the Tsarist regime's empire in the Middle East, and he considers the Soviet collapse under, I forgot his name at the moment, but it'll come to me. But the Soviet collapse in 1991 as a great, terrible thing that happened to the Russian people, he wants to restore. So he has thrown in his lot with the Chinese and with the Iranians in this new axis that I talked about earlier. So clearly there is a Russian dimension here, and don't forget the small Russian expeditionary force with some airplanes in Syria, which has been helping prop up the Assad regime in Syria. And they also had, for the first time, they have access to a warm sea Mediterranean naval base on the border of Syria, which was given to them by Assad, which is not unimportant to the Russians. So there are all kinds of connections going on here. Above all, however, if we draw back, there is the attempt by this new axis to weaken the United States, to weaken American resolve, to weaken the American support for a stable world order. And that's what's going on geopolitically. The Russians are funded increasingly by the Chinese. The Iranians are funded by both Russia and China. Their economic contacts are being expanded. all the time. And we are really in a situation that looks in many ways like what faced the United States in 1941.
In what
Will
sense?
there be a surprise attack equivalent to Pearl Harbor? Will the Chinese, for instance, suddenly attack Taiwan, or even people are talking about Hawaii again? Who knows? Hope not. The only way to deter that is what Reagan said. You've got to be strong. You have to prevent crises from happening through strength and determination and will. And that is what has been lacking in Washington since the Obama, Biden, and then the Biden-Obama administrations. That's a matter of 12 years. It's a long time in diplomatic, political, and military history. Okay, and that's the situation we're in today. And it's Israel, it's Hamas, and the invasion of October 7th, which has opened this whole thing up and clarified what's going on. It remains to be seen whether the Americans under Biden and, Lord help us, Harris, have the strength and the withal to resist, to do what has to be done. America has been terribly weakened, I should note, industrially and militarily. America has only 2 shipyards building ships. We're years and years behind the number of ships which the U.S. Navy needs to be a world power acting on Pacific and Atlantic fronts and across Asia and Latin America. Our allies are hopeless. Europe has very little military power and less capacity. They can't produce enough ammunition to supply themselves and the Ukrainians. China has almost 400 ships. They're building aircraft carriers. They're working on 6 aircraft carriers at once. The Americans can't build 1 or 2 in a reasonable length of time. Half the American submarines are out of commission. They can't be repaired. They can't be updated. It's a terrible, terrible moment. If anything, if you think strategically, the next year and this right now in the next year or 2, before a strong Republican administration comes to power in Washington, hopefully, this would be the moment for the new axis to act. That's why it's so dangerous.
It sounds dire and frightening, with America being so weakened militarily, economically, and the political will is lacking. For instance, although Biden came out full-heartedly in support of Israel, one after another, he's sending advisors to Israel to coerce Israel to limit its military operations in Gaza, Lebanon, and the Red Sea. What is going on with Biden now?
Well, it's a very good question. I looked at it a bit earlier. I think of T.S. Eliot. In the corridors, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. So the American diplomats come to Israel and warn Israel, you got to shorten your campaign. You got to watch out for these poor, helpless Palestinian civilians, by the way, who voted overwhelmingly for Hamas in Gaza, and who to this day are telling pollsters that they support Hamas to the tune of 70 to 80%, despite the destruction. So Israel is supposed to endanger its own troops in order to act in a civilized way. Israel, of course, does act in a civilized way, which is why the American supplication is so insulting, because Israel, the IDF, is the only army in the world which actually takes great steps to protect civilian populations, warning them of coming attacks, telling them to move, creating safe corridors, sending leaflets saying, get the hell out of here because we're going to destroy Hamas in your area. The Hamas, which lives in the underground tunnels and lives in people's homes and uses Palestinian civilians as shields. Israel doesn't need to be told how to act by the United States of all people, by the United States of Biden's Afghanistan disaster. So they come and they talk, and the Israeli cabinet smiles, and they leave, and the cabinet continues to do exactly what it has to do. I think that's the reality, and partially Netanyahu and the cabinet are waiting for the election of November 2024. By the way, I should say something very clearly here. Netanyahu and the top military and the heads of the Shin Bet and the Mossad and of the IDF intelligence are responsible, generally speaking, for what happened on October 7th. They are not going to survive politically, as far as I can see. They are in place. They have experience militarily. They are running this war. They have to do the best they can, and I hope they do, and I have confidence they will, but they have to take responsibility for what happened, just as Golda Meir took responsibility for the earlier wars. It's a principle of Israeli politics that the leadership is responsible for the security of the state. That's the number one responsibility of any government, but a fortiori, even more strongly, of any Israeli government, given the borders they have. You know, we talk about two-front war, three-front war. In World War I, there was a two-front war. Germany got caught in the two-front war. They had to fight the Russians in the north and the Allies, the French and the British in the south. That's why they built railroads, so they could transport their troops rapidly from the north to the south in order to avoid being crushed in a pincer's movement. But they had 1,000 and more miles of distance and geography to deal with. In Israel, your enemy is 30 miles away. In Israel, the country is 7 miles wide at its narrowest point, aside from the territories. Israel doesn't have the time and the distance to fight the two-front war. That's why Israel has to move with dispatch. That's why you had the Six-Day War and the lightning strike before the Arabs were able to invade. So they are responsible. And when push comes to shove, when the smoke clears, there's going to be a political realignment in Israel. Now, that's an interesting question, by the way. Allow me to say one or two things about that. It's very clear that one result of this terrible crisis and the ensuing conflict is a shift to the right in Israel. I think that the notion that somehow the religious parties are going to be weakened and the left is once again going to be strengthened is wrong. The left has shown that it's totally inept, that the peace process was a total failure in every respect. And I think that's a lesson not lost on Israel, which means that there'll be a shift from the left to the center. And I think the right will hold its ground, and therefore the new center of gravity will be, if anything, center-right in Israel. And much the same thing may happen in the United States, because if you look around Europe at the moment, from the British leaving the common market with Brexit to the election of Geert Wilders in Netherlands, an anti-immigration guy, a right-wing guy, to resentment of the Muslims in France, which is growing, so that the right-wing parties themselves are growing, this whole business of populism in Europe, to Orban in Hungary, who was an outlier in this respect. The same kind of thing is happening in the United States. The center-right is growing. Trump, despite all his tribulations, goes from strength to strength politically in terms of the polls. The left and Biden go down, down, down. And the expectation is this time around in November 24, there will be a kind of wave election sparked by inflation, by the horrible southern border with 8-9 million illegals, including many security threats coming in unhampered. All of this, the decline of the universities, the rise of anti-Semitism, all of this will lead to a wave election and tremendous shift to the center right in America as well. So we
And in
really are
Canada,
looking at,
and
we
in
really are
Canada,
looking, let me just finish, we're looking at world historical dynamics at play here, which have to work themselves out. We're in the middle of it now. And the book of the future, as they say, is the most difficult book of all to read. But we can begin to see certain chapters of that book emerging, I think.
let's go to Canada. Trudeau, Prime Minister Trudeau, and his response, especially the most recent event, which is voting for a ceasefire. Would you comment on our Prime Minister and his response?
Yes, yes, yes. I think when it comes to Trudeau and his co-henchman, Singh, the guy in the pink turban, the NDP enabler, because it's Singh who has enabled Trudeau to survive. The two of them together have a left-wing government, far more left-wing than even Biden in the States. Trudeau is, in many ways, a much worse figure than Biden, because I think he is, when you get down to it, an ideologue. He's a left-wing ideologue. He looks at China with a certain amount of sympathy as a place where you can get things done without being prevented by these democratic barriers. On all kinds of fronts, he has played a kind of left-wing socialist hand, which is out of sync with the large part of Canada. The Conservative Party under Poilievre is now polling, getting as much support as the Liberals and the NDP combined. And there is an election which is due, which is mandated by November 2005, I think, which may come sooner if there's a crisis and confidence motion is lost, so that we can see much the same thing happening in Canada as we can see happening in the US, only I think even more clearly, more strongly. In the US, if Gaza had happened in the US, if there had been, God forbid, a terrorist murder pogrom of equal size in the US, 23,000 Americans would have died. How many would have been taken hostage? Lord only knows. In Canada, of course, Canada is always about 1/10 of what happens in the US. So in Canada, you would have had maybe 2,400 people murdered and killed, and 20,000, 10,000, 15,000 hostages, who knows? You have to keep these figures in mind. We're walking on the margins. And one of the terrible things happening in Canada and in the US is in the number of terrorists, suspected terrorists who are getting in because of the porous borders, particularly the US, but also Canada to some extent. And Canada is becoming an important destination for illegal immigrants who come in through the northern border. The illegal immigration through the northern border is growing now, in part because all of the American border agents have been brought down to the south to try and put their fingers in the holes of the dike down there. So, I mean, we're looking at a very difficult situation, but it could be resolved in Canada through the accession of a decent, commonsensical, conservative government under a very able and talented figure, Pierre Poilievre.
You haven't mentioned Britain.
Britain.
The great,
yes, what's it?
Great Britain, the UK,
yeah.
in the
Great
power
Britain.
paradigm.
That's an interesting point. Good question. The British, of all the Europeans, have the greatest military tradition. But the British, like the Europeans, have allowed their military establishment to wane. The British are very badly equipped. They are short on tanks, they're short on artillery. They've given less and less money to the military budget, more and more to the social welfare world. And while in some ways the British are more forward-looking militarily than their colleagues on the continent, than the European Union, they are also a weak reed. Now, there is some attempt now being made, probably perhaps too late, to bolster the military budget in England, to ramp up the production of materiel and so on. But how that will be used remains to be seen. There is an election upcoming fairly soon in Britain. The Conservatives are on the ropes. They haven't done very well at all. There may be a resurgence of the Labour Party. And if that happens, all bets are off as to the British relation to world global dynamics.
I'm quoting you. We're just to go back to what is happening, especially in the United States and Canada. The woke progressive left is eating away at our universities and government and must be overcome.
Well, I think that that's self-evident. If you are a rational human being, you don't have to be Jewish, as the old dads used to say about the Eskimo eating rye bread. You don't have to be Jewish to realize that we are facing a cultural crisis. This started in the West with the Vietnam War, I think. Well, we could go back beyond that, but start with the Vietnam War, the rise of a kind of new left, the student movement, the university confrontations, the thought of Herbert Marcuse with his idea of liberal, what did he call it? Liberal respect. That is to say, you don't respect anything conservative. You don't give freedom of speech to the conservatives. The conservatives are all neo-fascists. Liberty and freedom belong only to the left. And out of that came, you know, the Frenchman who was teaching oppression. There are only two classes, oppressor and oppressors, and everything is power. All values, all notions of morality are simply filters for Michel Foucault, his name was. Morality is simply a filter for power. Mao Zedong was right. Power comes out of the muzzle of a gun. And out of that grew terrorism. So we are confronting this terrible moral reductionism. It's literally soul-less, no soul. The decline of religion, the decline of the family, the decline of the churches, of church attendance, all of which were sources of education for the young. That has markedly affected what's going on. I mean, people coming out of the K through 12 school system now already have imbibed these notions. They're ready to absorb what they're going to get when they come into university. The teachers' colleges were taken over, a very important conduit for this social, cultural rot. The teachers' colleges, which train the teachers who teach our children in grade school. And then, of course, the development on the left in the universities. And the horrible, horrible record of university administrators who are cowardly, who have allowed all of this to happen in return for going out and getting, you know, large salaries as a percentage of their fundraising. University presidents today are simply business people who fundraise for the universities. They've lost all commitment to what universities should represent, which was the search for truth, for openness, a meritocracy. We've had the meritocracy based on ability and drive and hard work has given way to the equity world, where you get grades based on who you are, the color of your skin, how far you kowtow to the dominant point of view. It's reached into the professions, into the sciences. George Washington University, I think the medical faculty recently voted to support Hamas. Can you imagine that? I mean, in order to get a job at universities today, you have to write an essay on how you're going to, in your work, regardless of what it is, you know, literary studies, political science, philosophy, you name it, you're going to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, which I think should be, the acronym should be DIE, die, because affirming that kind of set of values is death. And what we have is a horrible death-affirming culture that's emerging here. And it has to be fought. It has to be fought, and it has to be defeated. And there has to be fundamental and structural reform of the school system, K through 12, and of the university system. And that's a big order. That's a terribly big order. It's begun. People are no longer donating monies. Harvard has lost over $1 billion in donations since the horrendous congressional testimony of the 3 university presidents about a week ago. I think that's a tremendous moment in the turning around of the situation, the beginning of the reconstruction of our educational system. So with the family, with trying to recreate families with mothers and fathers and children who are brought up at home and imbibe basic values, with the reform of the family, the reform of the educational structure is underway. And if those two can be brought off and World War III avoided, that is nuclear conflagration, as on the basis of this global confrontation we've been talking about, if, then we have a chance to reconstitute the world. That's what we're looking at here. And once again, I want to come back to where I began, with the Hebraic tradition. We are confronting what Jews, what the Hebrews in their Bible, the Jews in their history have always known, and that is a Moloch. We confront a Moloch. A Moloch is evil. We confront evil again and again, and we're confronting it today. It manifests itself politically, it manifests itself culturally, it manifests itself pedagogically. And the forces of good have to rise up and be strong and be rational and be tough, and once again destroy a Moloch. Otherwise, how can we live without hope?
One final question. You believe, you said, that we are on the verge of World War III, and it has to be checked now.
I said we are possibly facing World War III. There are things which could happen, both in Ukraine and in Iran and in the Middle East, which would lead to a nuclear confrontation. That is the nightmare that we face. And that is what, above all, has to be avoided. But the way to avoid it is through the destruction of the Iranian mullahs and the weakening of China and the separation of Russia from China and the neutering of the North Koreans, who should not have a nuclear weapon because they are irrational. These things have to happen. That's done through politics. That's done through force. It's done through the military. It's done through determined political leadership. Above all, what we need, what the world needs, is rational, strong, life-affirming American political leadership. That is what we're lacking. I think we can all hope that perhaps Biden will stumble through and we'll get to November 04 and we'll get a decent American administration which will begin the work of reconstruction. We live in an age which cries out for reconstruction, and that is a hopeful sign. It can be done. What's lacking is will. Okay? Let us hope that we will find together that will.
Thank you, Professor Krantz, for shedding light on a very complicated and terrifying world. For more of the same, tune in, look out for us, CIJR, Canadian Institute for Jewish Research. We'll be back, and check in with get our daily briefing so that you can depend on facts, on depth, on context, on people that know what's going on in the world, so that you don't get it secondhand and get misinformed. Goodbye for now. Keep safe and keep warm.